Hello and welcome to another Delving into the Little Delvings, the series where we take a closer look at those visualizations of data from the Digital Tolkien Project that we like to call Little Delvings. Now we post these Little Delvings to various social media accounts, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky and Twitter, so if you're on any of those platforms be sure to check us out. We also post the Little Delvings to the website delvings.digitaltolkien.com, so you can always go there to view them. Now in this video we're going to look at Little Delvings 7 through 13, and I'm going to address a question that often gets asked: what is a chunk and what is a token? Because they're two terms that often get mentioned in Little Delvings. So let's delve right in. So in this first Little Delving, number 7, we're looking at the number of times that the words Shire, Rohan and Gondor are mentioned by each book in Lord of the Rings. So remember, like many of the Little Delvings we do, this is focused on occurrences of the words, rather than necessarily the story being located in those particular places. We are actually doing some work tracing the location of the narrative throughout all of the 6 books. That will come later, but for now this is just focused on mentions of these places. One of the things I like about this is you see this clear U-shape in the Shire. The Shire gets talked about a lot in Book 1 and it comes back in Book 6, but it really drops down in the middle. In contrast, Rohan rises and so does Gondor, although notice Rohan is very rarely mentioned in Book 4 because of course that's where we have that split between Frodo and Sam on the one hand and the others in the Fellowship. So clearly Book 3 and Book 5 have more of a focus on Rohan, but Book 5 is really the book that focuses on Gondor, of course. Moving on to Little Delving 8. And this kind of visualization is actually one of my favorites, where we take two alternatives and we show them side by side by work as well. So we get a sense both of the contrast within the book between the two terms and also the differences between the 3 works. In this case, we're looking at the uncontracted do not versus the contracted don't. Now I've shown a visualization similar to this before, but there it was focused just on within speech. This time I used both direct speech and the narrative. So this is counting occurrences anywhere in the text of these 3 works. Now, one of the questions that people have asked is, what is a token? It says the frequency per 10k tokens. Now, token is a word that's used in corpus linguistics to resolve an ambiguity in the word word. If you take something like, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, there are a couple of words that get repeated. In and a get repeated twice. Do we count those as 2 different words or are they the same word? Well, to get over that ambiguity, corpus linguists talk about types and tokens. Tokens refer to the actual instances on the text. So if you're talking about tokens in The Hobbit, it has about 95,000 different tokens, although it's not 95,000 unique words. And so we use the term token to make it clear that we're talking about occurrences of the word, not different types of words. And the reason we do this whole frequency per 10k tokens in the first place is obviously these 3 works have different lengths, and we don't want to bias these numbers by length of the work. And so we look at how many times each of these occur per 10,000 words, or more precisely, per 10,000 tokens. Just as an aside, the whole question of what constitutes a token can get a little more involved once you start to ask questions about whether punctuation counts and how you handle hyphenated words. There's actually a blog post from a few years ago that I wrote about the number of tokens in The Hobbit, and I'll link to it in the description below if you're interested in more of the details about what constitutes a token and what doesn't. But coming back to this, obviously one of the main things that this conveys is that The Hobbit contracts do not to don't much more often. The Silmarillion, in fact, never contracts do not to don't. And Lord of the Rings, it's almost 50-50. In fact, if you just look within direct speech, it is almost exactly 50-50. Now, obviously, this has a lot to do with style. The Hobbit is a lot more casual in style. The Silmarillion is a lot more formal in style. And that's the main reason for this do not, don't distinction. Where it becomes really interesting, though, is in something like Lord of the Rings, given that it's pretty much 50-50, it raises the question, well, when does do not get used? When does don't get used? And it turns out that has almost everything to do with who is speaking. And I'll do a different visualization in the future to really show that, because it is really, really interesting to look at. Little Delving number 9 shows the number of chunks per chapter in The Hobbit, and we'll obviously do this for other works in the future as well. But one question people often have is, what is a chunk? What do I mean by chunk here? And again, this is trying to be a little clearer in the terminology. I could have said paragraphs per chapter. The issue is that not everything in The Hobbit is a paragraph. And so if you look at the citation system that we've developed at the Digital Tolkien Project, we group things into chapters, but the next level down in the citation system under chapter consists not only of paragraphs, but things like chapter headings and verses of poetry, the components of letters, block quotations, inscriptions, and so on. And so to be clear that we're not just talking about paragraphs, we are also including things like stanzas of verse in this count. We use the term chunk to basically describe any unit directly under the chapter. So that's what we mean here by chunks per chapter. And the main point here is that the chapter lengths, measured not necessarily by tokens, but by, in this case, chunks, varies quite a lot within The Hobbit. You get some very short chapters like 3, 4, 11 and so on, and some very long ones. The opening chapter is particularly long, so are 2, 5, 7 and 8 and so on. So you can get a sense that actually things started to get shorter as the story progressed, from 13 onwards particularly, but also from 9 to 11, 3 and 4 are considerably shorter than the surrounding chapters, at least in terms of the number of chunks. This says nothing about whether those chunks were longer or shorter themselves. This is just the number of chunks. And we could do a separate visualization showing the number of tokens in each of the chapters of The Hobbit, and we'll certainly do that in the future, as well as do a visualization like this for other books as well, other works. Now we come to Little Delving 10, which is another one that is counting the number of occurrences of particular words across the 6 books of Lord of the Rings. In this case, we're looking at mentions of Gollum and Smeagol. So just to emphasize again, this is not occurrences of the character. This is mentions of the actual word Gollum and Smeagol. So you can see that it's really book 4 where both the name Gollum and the name Smeagol dominate. In every single book, Gollum is used more than Smeagol, but they get used both in every single book. It's very difficult to see, but there is a small amount of usage in book 5 and book 3, as well as even in book 6, there's a little bit of Smeagol mentioned there as well. Now, we've done this kind of comparison of alternative names before with Aragorn and Strider. If you have any other ideas for things you'd like to see a comparison of across the Lord of the Rings books, let us know in the comments. Now in Little Delving 11, we get to another one of these comparative frequencies, where we take 2 terms and look at how they differ in frequency across 3 different works. And this is a particularly fun one. This is the word evil and the word good. And again, this is the frequency of these words per 10,000 tokens. And yet again, I want to emphasize that we're counting the words evil and good. So this is not evil as a concept or good as a concept. This is literally the occurrences of evil and good. There's another thing that's important to consider here, which is particularly the word good has different senses, not always the opposite of evil. We could have also done something like bad versus good, with a different sense of good. We get things like good morning and so on, where it's not really in contrast to an evil morning. But it's still interesting here because we're comparing evil versus good across these 3 different works. And again, I love this visualization because it so clearly shows the dominance of the word good, not necessarily the concept good, but the word good in The Hobbit. Lord of the Rings is much more of a balance, although at the end of the day it tips towards good, whereas the Silmarillion is much more about the word evil. Again, not necessarily the concept, although I'm sure you'll agree, it probably extends to the concept as well. This is measuring the use of those words, and I still think it's actually really interesting to look at, particularly in comparing one work to another. Now we come to Little Delving 12, which is another visualization of the distribution of words per paragraph. In the previous video, we looked at the same sort of thing for The Hobbit. Now I say paragraphs here because this is just looking at paragraphs. It's not looking at verse or other types of blocks within a chapter. It is focused just on paragraphs. I say words here. I could have said tokens here to be a little more precise, but it is what it is. Now, if you go back and look at the similar distribution for The Hobbit, you'll see it's very similar. It rises very quickly to a peak and then drops off very, very slowly. This is a histogram that basically bins the paragraph lengths by 10. So each column represents a range from 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, and so on. Now, what always happens in these kinds of distributions is this very long tail. It really does extend out very far. As you can see, the longest paragraph is way over here. When we first did this kind of visualization, people asked to see what the longest paragraph was, not just be told what its reference was and the number of words it has. And so we did that for The Hobbit, and we did that again for The Lord of the Rings. And so if we come to the next delving, the last for this video, number 13, we get the actual text. Now this is small, but it's deliberately so, right? This is the longest paragraph in the entire Lord of the Rings. It makes sense to convey the length of it with a small typeface, which we needed to do to fit it in anyway. This is, of course, Strider recounting the story of Beren and Luthien. Paragraph 148 of Chapter 11 of Book 1 of Lord of the Rings, the longest paragraph coming in at 483 words. I hope you find these videos on the Little Delvings interesting. If you have any ideas for other Little Delvings we can do, be sure to leave a comment. And if you're interested in other work that the Digital Tolkien Project is doing, be sure to check out the other videos, particularly the monthly updates that I do, that are live streamed, but you can also always watch the videos afterwards. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.